Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer. And today we're having a discussion about art. So who better to bring on than one of the best artists that I know?
Gee. Hi, guys. It's Monty. Face is out this time around. I felt like it was probably time to actually turn on the camera. But anyway, yeah, I'm real excited to be here. I love discussing these types of things. I love talking about artwork, and I sure do appreciate you saying that. If you wish to find me anywhere, I mean, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram under Galneth underscore or just Galneth. But the most interaction you'll likely get with me is on the Discord server.
And I will link her Instagram in the description below if I remember. But usually I also tag her and stuff all the time because I use her art all over the channel. She has drawn some of our characters. So
thank you.
around. So this conversation is being had because I know it was like a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago specifically, I brought up the difference between art and art-like product and kind of all of this discussion around the creative control that people are trying to have over artists who are just creating stuff and then demanding it in a sort of, well, you need to produce the product. And it also has to do with the way that this goes back to when somebody took all of the George R.R. Martin books and put it through a generative AI because they decided that he wasn't writing fast enough for them. So they were going to steal it because there are certain consumers that see artwork as not artwork, but as a product to be consumed and that it is owed by the creators. So there's a lot of discussion about art going on. I'm also going to preface this by saying we are not art historians. No. We're just artists. We have some insight into art, but we also want to bring forth some ideas of what we are thinking about the concept of art. And we're not telling anybody what to think, but we wanted to have a discussion of just the way that we see things, what we've seen, and just
how we're feeling about it.
How we're feeling about it. And I think that there's one thing that is really happening right now that a lot of people don't understand because they aren't studiers of art is that people are choosing aesthetics or choosing genres of art to say one is categorically better than the other, but that's not actually how artistic movements really work. There are classifications of different artistic movements and artistic styles, and they're not objectively better than the other. They just exist. Because otherwise, the people saying one version is better than the other is like saying, well, somebody who does thyroid cancer is better than a phlebotomist. And it's but it's just different types of doctors.
It's like apples and oranges.
Somebody that does knee surgery is better than an OBGYN. It's just different specializations. And so that's kind of what's happening with art is people are choosing a style of art and saying this is objectively better when it's after you get past the classifications, it's just a personal preference as to what style of art you like more. So we're going to talk about, and then you've got art-like products, which is also a thing. So we're going to talk about a lot of these different things and get into some of the discussions that we're seeing. And then, there is so much discussion around art and insulting art that people are misusing the term modern art to insult art without knowing that they actually do like modern art. What they're talking about is postmodern art. So we're going to get into some of that. But before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemoy, the monthly prompt writing contest where I give you a prompt. You write a short story using that prompt on the first Monday video of the month. We bask in that creativity, and this is generally a judgment-free zone for genre because we do want to celebrate most genres, not pornography, but pretty much everything else. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit your first chapter and your cover, it'll be right here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work, because regardless of what you've written, there is an audience out there somewhere. They just got to know that you exist. And then the third thing is if you would like to check out any of my books, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the library. Bodymore Zero coming out later this year.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have anything that you want to add, Monty?
Well, I was thinking, the whole idea of this absurd notion that there are people out there when in reality they'll talk about what's objectively good, and a lot of them will say, "Oh, well, what's objectively good is good anatomy," when cartoons exist. I understand that you have to know the rules to break them, understandably, but that doesn't mean that people are going to prefer that style because it's just realistic looking. That doesn't make it objectively better. It's just a preference at the end of the day. No matter how much these people that say this, who, by the way, most of the people who are bitching about this aren't even artists. They have no experience in writing. They have no experience in drawing. They have no experience in any form of art history. They don't even know what the term modern art is. They throw it around like no one's business. I mean, it's gotten to the point where it's as bad as the ist things, the racist, sexist, bigot stuff that people hear all the time. But people have such like an issue with detaching their own idea of what is objective to them is not actually really objective at all. It's just their preference. And nobody really likes the idea of being wrong. And so where this argument stems from is not this need to be a perfectionist in what you're doing, but this need to be correct. And I think that that is absurd because art has always been a subjective field. And we've discussed on how art, is art, art is subjective, but the only objective thing about it is that it is art, right? We know what we're looking at when we look at a painting. And just because somebody doesn't like that painting doesn't mean that it's not a piece of art, all right? Subjectivity isn't to say anything can be art. Subjectivity is what you take away from something that you're looking at, And I just wanted to state that because I've seen it so often. I've seen people make this argument time and time and time and time and time again. And half the time, if not most of the time, or really all the time, they don't know what they're talking about. They just don't. And I've gotten to the point where I'm very frustrated with it. I'm like, you guys don't have any experience. And what I love about art is that I view art as a language that other artists speak, regardless of what it is, whether it's a painting, it's a song, it's a book, it's a game, it's some form of writing. Other artists take inspiration from other artists, or anything really. But when we see something that somebody has done and has inspired us, that is a personal thing. But it does communicate to us what this artist is thinking and feeling. And even if it's not like beautiful, right? You can still see the emotion behind something. And I've always appreciated that.
The different ways that somebody can interact with art, because it's not just artists that interact with art, but then you have the audience or the consumer of the art that also will have a response. And there are generally two main ways in which they will respond to that art, which will either be, and to grade that art, how they responded to that art based on their experience. And it'll either be because of how it made them feel or because of what it made them think. And it's not usually both, because they might be like, this made me feel like crap. However, it got me thinking of these certain things and I appreciated the thoughts that it gave me. And so I liked that piece as a thought piece. Or somebody can look at a book that's, something like ACOTAR, that's not going to make you think, it's meant to make you feel. And then people will have an emotional response to it, be like, I like this because it made me feel a lot of things.
Exactly.
And so somebody can respond with either, and it doesn't make something better or worse, because that is a subjective choice as to whether you prefer art that makes you think or art that makes you feel.
Yeah.
And it's just an individual, a personal choice, which is one of the reasons, like when I do my book reviews, I'm never trying to tell anybody how to feel or what to think. And I often say, go and read it for yourself, or I invite people to go read it for themselves because they're going to have a different experience. I can only share what my experience is and my critique. And even the way that I do ratings is very different from how other people do ratings. And I try to be honest about that because I'm responding to the experience that I had with the book. I don't care if it makes me think, because I think about every book that I read.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. And, a lot of people, from what I have noticed, whenever, you express your opinion, this is just how reality is. And I think it's probably always in this way. It's just a little bit more obnoxious because everyone has a social media. But whenever I see people just expressing an opinion, the knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people is to try and tell them that they're wrong. And I'm like, I'm really getting tired of that. I mean, sometimes maybe you can be wrong about something, like it's a mistake, you literally misread something, but most of the time I think that's fairly rare. Or you're misquoting somebody, or you didn't do proper research into something. That can be, I don't have an issue with that being called out. What I have an issue with is like somebody saying that they really liked this movie, but because there's a big chunk of people who say that they didn't like it, those big chunk of people are going to determine whether or not that their feelings are objective. And so usually when objectivity comes into the mix with art, it's always boiled down to, okay, so who is setting the standard of objective fact with art? Who are the people that are setting the standard? Because it all comes from a personal preference. And when it boils down to is like money and the majority vote. But usually what happens when somebody within one of those groups exits and then goes into another group, and that other group starts to unanimously disagree with what this person is saying, does that therefore mean that that group is right because their majority vote counts as objective? Because that's sort of the reasoning that I've seen people discuss this over. It's all, the more people like something and all are in agreement with it, therefore they assume it is objective, that it is good. Or it is bad.
Which is funny because every artistic movement happened as a rejection of the majority of what was popular.
Yeah.
Like I remember in theater history, we talked about realism was in theater, and then it got to ultra realism, where there's a section of time period where people wanted the stage plays to be as realistic as possible. So if the set was meant to be in a barn, then they would go and get hay that was actually from a barn with animal stuff on it, because they wanted to make it as realistic as possible. And so people got fed up with the hyper realism, and that flung it into surrealism and Dadaism, because you push so hard and then you get the opposite pushback. And so that's
pendulum swings back.
Yep. And so that's kind of what you get. Now, that's not to say that there are not objective standards. Opinions are not objective standards. The objective standards that come to art are the definitions of the categories of art. So you can say, is this objectively surrealism? Is this objectively a picture? Is this objectively music? Does this classify as a movie? Those are objective standards of art to identify the art. And then the categories of art, be it, is this novel a fantasy novel? Is this novel a romance novel? Because there are elements that identify something as those things. Is this novel a satire? Is this novel XYZ? So those are objective standards. Now, the way that you interpret something is subjective. And I've witnessed so many times, specifically with like Sam Fenna's book, with Shad Brooks's book, with Will Jordan's book, somehow not at all with the ALA books.
I don't even know how that's even I'm shocked, actually. Like,
people showing up in my comments to tell me I absolutely am just stupid because they didn't like the way that I interpreted the books. I can say the same thing about my interpretation of Akatar with Tamlin and Rhysand and Feyre's relationship, where I see it as abusive, where I see Tamlin in A Court of Mist and Fury as being ignored and specifically demonized despite his own trauma, while Rhysand uses his trauma in order to get the feelings of the reader because he's being manipulative, but the book wants you to like Rhysand. I can observe it that way, and everybody who loves Rhysand can tell me that I've interpreted it wrong. I've now seen people plenty of times say, if you have a different interpretation of something, then you're stupid and your opinion is invalid because you think differently. And that is just, bullying's not really a word that I want to use for it, because it's just closed-minded, and bigotry is what it is your inability to think outside of the box. But you can have different interpretations. Something taking away from this art. There is a song, it's a cover by Mayday Parade. Sorry, because I don't remember the original. But the song is In My Head. And it's about a guy going to a club and picking up a girl. And he like picks up a girl who is all by herself, and he's like, you're out here looking for love. You're not going to find it dancing with him. So why don't you come with me outside? And when I hear that song, I imagine a serial killer going into a party and picking up a girl. And then you get to the chorus where it's in my head. I see you all over me in my head. You fulfill my
I know that
fantasy.
song, and
And
honestly, I see why you would think that too. That's a really interesting perspective because, like, yeah, that is really creepy. Or like,
he goes
um,
in and he targets the girl that he sees as being lonely and says, I can give you something, and then takes her outside and then murders her. And it can have all of the same meaning as I see you all over me, because he's obviously
mhm,
slashing her open. You fulfill
mhm,
my fantasy because, murders like that are usually a sexual crime.
mhm.
And so, but does that mean that I'm stupid because I interpret it a different way? No,
No,
that's one of the things with art, and that's how you end up telling different stories off of the same thing. So I personally find it very offensive in general when you're in an art conversation and somebody comes in to go, well, your thought process is just wrong, so your opinion is invalid.
that's so dumb. I'm just like,
It's okay if you have the same details, because
yeah.
obviously if we're listening to the same song, we're getting the same details. And then because of our backgrounds, the way that we think, the way that we interpret, is going to be different. So if the details are correct and the interpretation is different, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's how art generally works.
That's also how you end up having conversations about art in the first place. Because if we were to quote unquote do everything what they would assume would be objectively, there would be no need for conversation because we would just be talking about the objective facts of what we just looked at. Is it a painting? Yes. Is it colorful? Yes. Is it blue? Yes. It's blue. That's an objective fact about something. If you say the painting is blue, it's a picture of a person. Does that look like a person? Yeah, that is an objective thought process. There's no room for conversation, no room for really any discussion of how someone interprets something. Like, I would have never interpreted that song the way you interpreted it, ever. But then when I think about it, I'm like, yeah, I can see where you'd get that, but that doesn't mean it's going to change my mind. It just means I see where you're coming from.
Oh, come on, because you'll be screaming, oh, in my head, in my head. He's
I mean,
murdering her in the back
okay,
alley.
okay, I was thinking like maybe something not like that, but
Well, I know what it's supposed to be and I know what it is meaning. But for me, like the first time I heard that song, I was like, this guy's a serial killer. Like, and that's all that I ever hear it as. And I know generally that is probably not what they mean. But
right, there's a song
there's also
like
that difference between there's the artist's actual intent, and then the audience's understanding. And the audience's understanding will vary from everybody. And that's fine. That's one of the things that is kind of always sketchy, specifically with books, because readers pick up the book, interpret the book, and then will say that their interpretation is the intent of the author,
which they can't possibly
can't
know that.
really do.
No, unless the author told them exactly what they wanted to do with the book. Right?
And now I don't think that is wrong. An audience member can reinterpret a story. The thing is then imposing what you believe as this is what the author meant to do, or then making personal claims about the author. So they'll be like, well, the author wrote this because clearly they are a racist. You have to be able to explore things in fiction. People do put themselves in fiction, but it's not as straightforward as people think.
And then there's a lot of people who talk about like the internal logic of something. This was a discussion that was happening in the server yesterday, and it was a really, an interesting conversation that eventually just kind of ceased, which fine. But there was this idea of internal logic making a objectively good told story, whenever it's like there are clearly books out there right now who don't follow an internal logic, who don't have a good continuity. And then the grammar gets brought up, and the first person I think of is Cormac McCarthy. He is a prolific, revered author who did not do what you would refer to as like an objective grammar over his writing. He said he didn't want to mark up the page with all those dashes. He does not use quotation marks for any time a character speaks. He barely uses a comma, and yet he is still revered as one of the most prolific authors that prolific American author that we've ever known. And may God rest his soul, he's given us a lot of great things, but he did not write in a traditional way. And yet he still managed to capture the attention of people. Now, some people don't want to read Cormac, and I understand. It can be very difficult to get into that if you're not used to that sort of prose, right? But that doesn't mean anything unless it is so bad that it is unreadable. Like everything's misspelled. It's just a big jumbled up thing of stew of words. And even then, some people have gotten away with being super, super experimental, like House of Leaves, for example. You know, that book is bizarre, you know, and it's got no logic or consistency in it. It's just bizarre. But people still love it for some reason. Because for whatever reason, it's just captured somebody's attention and captured a group of people's attention, right? And however they interpreted the book that got their favor for it, that's fine. I didn't like House of Leaves. I thought it was super arrogant, but that's just what I think. And I think people have a really hard time accepting that, and I don't know why. It's like, really what it's boiling down to, again, is the fact that they do not like the fact that you enjoy something they dislike.
This takes me into freaking every time I say I don't like fantasy. And then people are like, okay, I need you to anally, retentively describe to me what fantasy is in your words, so then I can tell you that you don't understand what actual fantasy is. And so like I've gone from epic fantasy, high fantasy, big world fantasy,
medieval
style fantasy, medieval style fantasy. And every single time somebody nitpicks at my words to go, well, that's not actually what fantasy is like. So you don't actually know if you like fantasy or not, because fantasy is this other thing. And it's like people can't accept it. I'm not saying that anything is wrong with fantasy, that you can't love fantasy, but for some reason, if you say you don't like something and somebody likes it, they feel like they need to correct you to be on board with them.
I know and I don't know what it is. And you know what, fantasy authors, fantasy readers, I'm calling you out right now. You are probably the only people out of every reader of every other genre that does this. I have never gotten this from contemporary readers. I've never gotten this from horror readers. I've never gotten this from romance readers or thrillers or mysteries. I've never gotten any, but it's always fantasy readers who will try and challenge you as to why you don't like fantasy. There is a criteria that is actually an objective thing that comes with the knowing when something is fantasy, right? We were talking about this last night. Like, you can't just market a spy thriller in a fantasy genre. There's nothing in there that would meet the criteria that would make it a fantasy, right? But for some reason, it's like they try and also, you know, cultivate every other genre because it has fantasy elements in it. I'm like, no, that is not it. Stop trying to dominate people. If she doesn't like fantasy or high fantasy, then that's her preference. I don't like high fantasy. I don't like most fantasy. And for some reason, people can't accept that. I don't know why.
And then it starts getting into this thing where you say, look, here's the objective standard, here is the subjective standard, and the things that I like or don't like. And it's fine if we disagree on the subjective ones. So, and then determine, well, this is what makes me like a book. Like, I like specifically character-driven novels. Now, that doesn't mean I love every novel that's character-driven, but I know that I'm going to like novels that are character-driven because I like to watch character make choice, see consequence, the world around them interacts. And so then the journey matters. And I know that some people like the adventure novels or like to see the characters go on a journey to become a hero. And that's fine. I don't prefer those novels. But it doesn't make one better than the other. And if you say, look, I prefer this, I don't prefer that, and that's fine, we can have a difference of opinion, then suddenly you start getting into the conversation of, well, if everything is subjective, if one isn't better than the other, then no opinion matters. And that's not what having a personal preference means. No.
And that's not what subjectivity means either. That's not what anybody is saying when people say that we have a subjective view on something. It is us saying there is meaning in almost everything that you look into. It's art, right? There's always some sort of meaning there if it is art. When we say that art is subjective and opinions are subjective, that doesn't mean that every opinion is meaningless. I'm not saying that your opinion is meaningless. That's not what that means. It just means that it's your own interpretation of something over something that you've just all collectively witnessed together. And everyone will either come away with a different perspective, or some people might have the same perspective, but with differing, things going on in their opinions. But it doesn't mean that things are meaningless. And I hate it when people say stuff like that. It's like, no, it's the same thing. It's like, it will, if everything is subjective, that means everything can be art. That's absolutely not what that means. We talked about it at the beginning of this.
That's postmodernism. We'll get to it
That's
too.
postmodernism.
But like on that note, going back to the In My Head song, just because I see it as a murder song does not mean that it's invalid because I'm in the minority. And it doesn't mean that other people who see it as the romance rock song of hooking up, that their version is invalid because we have different opinions. And if somebody goes, oh, I like the idea of it being a murder song better, that doesn't mean the other ones are invalid.
No, it doesn't. And it's funny you mentioned that song because there's another song that I was like, I heard it in the car. It's a song by this guy named George Harrison. And it's like, I got my mind set on you, but it's going to take time. It's going to take money. It's going to take a whole lot of money. It's going to take plenty of money to do it right, child. I'm like, well, what are you fitting to do, dude? Because I thought, is this a stalker? This is the stalker song. You have to buy all the equipment I need to follow after you. I'm going to need to buy a new apartment. I'm going to need to leave the certain city, get a new car. It's going to take a lot of time to just get to know what you're doing and your routine, your day. Like, that's what I saw it as. So I know where you're coming from when you say something like that. I do.
So we're going to get into some of the other discussions now that, we've prefaced with a bunch of food for thought. And this is starting with an article from artistryfound.com talking about the purpose of art, what you need to know. The purpose of art is to allow people, both individually and in group settings, to express emotions, commemorate history, expose injustice, overcome obstacles, or gain an understanding of the world around them. And in gaining an understanding of the world around them, it can be expressing an emotion, expressing an experience. A lot of what we do with storytelling specifically is packaging experiences up to share those experiences or viewpoints with the readership. Yeah. If you look at the way that, especially, like, it doesn't matter what, if you write first person or third person, but if you look at the way that I have written Bodymore, I pull you into those characters' heads to show you those experiences of those characters. And I want the one reason that I chose to do first person for those stories is, one, not only did it feel right, two, it worked better for the surrealism to kind of trick you at just the same way that they are tricked, not to trick you, but to put you in their headspace of not being able to see what is reality and what is not reality. And that is to give you as close of an experience to those narrators' experiences as possible. And so that's what it is you're trying to show somebody the world as you see it by whatever means you use, be it first person, third person, present tense, past tense, second person. These are all just tools to try to express an experience to somebody else successfully. And so when we're critiquing work, we're trying to not necessarily hit some ideal gold standard, but we're trying to get our work to express as closely as possible what it is we're trying to say. And at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons why when I do crits or have people critique me, I just want to know how they read something. And if they end up going, I hate Joey. She's so impulsive and she makes stupid decisions and blah, blah, blah. I go, okay, you read her right. And then your judgment on her is whatever it is, which means that I did my job correctly, is people understood who she is and then cast judgment on her based on who she is.
Exactly. It's funny you say that because I was having this conversation somewhat similarly with somebody else. And I was saying, when we discuss, because there's a very famous saying, I'm not sure who said it. I don't know where it came from or but every writer has probably heard this, which is the saying, write what you know. And a lot of people interpret that to be in setting, right? Their own culture. And I think, in the way I interpret that, I think it means to write and draw on from your own experiences to insert into what you're writing. Essentially how you feel about something. Not necessarily that, you have to have a character that's a writer to just be exactly like you, or a character who lives in the same town as you did or whatever. I think it more along the line. It could mean all of those things at once, but the way I have always seen it is to write from your own and draw on from your own experiences, the way something made you feel. I think there's more, you can, create a more authentic environment that way while also learning where you are at the same time. But whenever, we're talking about expression and art, art is self-expression no matter what.
See, I interpret that phrase as something that's done a lot more subconsciously Whereas you end up writing what you know, because you write what you're obsessed with. You write what has meaning to you. You write what you want other people to see. So like if you look at what I write a lot of, I write a lot of broken families. I write a lot of people that are from less fortunate circumstances. Like Joey is a dropout. Casey and Ralph are dropouts. If you look at even with the aliens, they lose their family and their story is about building a family. If you look at the Westies, they have a broken family and it's about finding a new family. I write a lot about that camaraderie.
Yeah, you do.
And so that's something that I unconsciously am obsessed with, but I start writing it because I know the loneliness and I am obsessed with going through that journey and the people finding that healing, which is also why all of my stories end with hope.
Yeah.
But so I see write what you know is as more of a you subconsciously write what you know, which is whatever is in your head.
Too. I get what you're saying. Because I saw myself doing that when I was writing the revision for Numina. I was like, oh, I know exactly. Like, you know, or even own personal experiences. I threw a few real life stories into a couple of the characters, just kind of talking about stuff that happened to people I knew, that I was there to experience, because I felt like it was like, it would make things more, I wouldn't say authentic, but like, I felt like it just add like a personal touch. I don't know, just something about it, just it made me want to do that.
Or there's stuff like you have your own personal set of interests, like the media or the history content that you absorb. I know people that are obsessed with the Roman Empire. You know, I am obsessed with my own true crime, kind of historical, psychological stuff. And that's how I ended up putting Bodymore in Baltimore, is because I love abandoned buildings. And I follow a couple of people on YouTube, one of them being Dan Bell. And he is from Baltimore. And so I got to experience a lot of Baltimore through his videos where he goes to abandoned buildings. And so then that was in my head. And so then come time to start writing Bodymore, the idea just came to me because the information was already in my head from years ago of consuming this content. So I think that just the stuff that you consume and the stuff that's important to you finds a way to come out of you one way or another.
I have done a lot of stories, whether it's through role play or what I'm doing now, but I have, despite the fact that the ocean absolutely scares the living hell out of me, I write a lot about coastal towns. I've never been to a coastal town before, but something about them I find to be interesting because I love the atmosphere of a coastal town. There's something very mysterious about them. And that's why I said, you know, Numina Star, the first one in Miami Beach, because that is a coastal town. Miami Beach is an island off of Miami. So, and I can't, you know, at first I couldn't even tell you why I decided to choose Miami Beach or Florida or whatever, but something about coastal towns has always appealed to me. And then it just kind of happened subconsciously, like you said, like you like buildings, old abandoned buildings and graffiti and stuff like that. And it was like subconsciously done. And then you're like, oh, that seems like a really good place to put this, because of your own obsessions and interests. And I'm obsessed with coastal towns. You know, I love the Lost Boys. I think that's probably where it came from, actually, is the Lost Boys, because I love that whole environment, you know, the vampires and it being on this like really cool, in California, on this really cool coastal town where they had this like this boardwalk that had this carnival on it and everything. I just thought that was the coolest, neatest thing for an environment, and it's always just stuck with me. You know, when I watched The Lost Boys when I was like 12 years old, and I'm 32 now, so.
At its center, art is a form of self-expression, empowering the artist to capture, show, and otherwise express themselves through their medium of choice. In some conversation, opining, we'll see in a little bit, I think this is being forgotten as consumers assume that artists are there to feed their consumption. As opposed to previously, it was like, hey, go look at things, see what you like, and then go and find more of what you like from that person. I'm now seeing a lot of conversations that are artists owe me this thing. Artists have to listen to me.
Yes, they think that we're their dancing monkeys. You know, it's weird because when I see it, I'm just like, you're not paying me to do any of this. Like you're like telling me, you know, generalizing artists, right? The artists need to do this. So generalizing the artist means that you're also including me. All right. So you're essentially telling me and demanding of me that I have to perform a certain way from you that goes against everything that I want to do just to make you happy. That is not some objective fucking standard. That is just you wanting something that you cannot attain yourself, so you're going to demand it from other people, and say that this is the objective way to do something, to try and get your way, when really it's all based on personal preference.
And there's a fine balance, and I understand to some extent from previous situations where producers, not specifically artists, but producers like of companies have said, we're going to make this thing and you are going to like it. So then there is some protesting pushback of consumers saying, no, you are going to make things for us. And then that's spilling into everybody, where there needs to be the appreciation from the artist to the audience that says, hey, thank you for your time. But there also needs to be the appreciation, understanding from certain audience members that the artist is not there to create for you. The artist is self-expressing. And if you like that, then you can you can keep going. And if you don't like it, then you can step away.
Yeah. Nobody is forcing anybody to do anything. That's the problem. And I don't really understand. It's like, you don't have to consume this. You don't have to give your money to this. If you have determined that you don't like it, then don't bother with it. It's a very weird thing, because that's what I do. If I don't want to see something and if I'm not interested in it, I don't interfere with it. I don't even discuss it with people. I just move on and find something I do take interest in.
And then that's not to say that you can't have an opinion on something that you don't enjoy or didn't enjoy, because I obviously do book reviews on this channel. But there's a high difference between saying, I experienced this thing, this was my experience with said thing, and then going to the producer of said thing and saying, no, you owe it to me to make it my way.
Yeah.
One is just you having an audience experience, and then the other is becoming demanding. So art can also teach others history, compassion, and empathy. Ultimately, art exists to preserve humans in their most pure and raw forms, which is sometimes beautiful, sometimes ugly. But this is also why generative AI can never be art, because it does not contain human expression. It does not contain a human experience. No, other than, what it stole from the amalgamation of art that went into it.
A lot of people think that Tolkien said this, which is that evil cannot create, it can only replicate. But I think it was somebody else who said it, but it doesn't make it any less true. I mean, that, you see the way it's replicate. It's like these Frankenstein images together that nobody created except for this machine after it was scraped from people that, without their consent. Stealing anything is wrong. I don't care if it's on the internet, To
define art, to understand the purpose and definition of art overall, you need to understand what art is and what it isn't. From a technical viewpoint, there is no official definition of the word. Art often consists of various human activities requiring creativity, imagination, and technical skill to complete. Most scholars agree that art is a byproduct of culture, and art forms date back to the existence of the earliest humans. Additionally, you can classify art into many categories, including performing and fine arts, paintings, sculptures, movies, decorative arts, and other topics. Another important topic to consider when determining the purpose of art is to consider the art's creation. For instance, you've likely watched a TV show or movie. At the ending credits, seen a long list of artists, producers, designers of the film. But can only experts create art? In short, no. Almost anyone can make art with or without experience. So that's been brought into the conversation too, of what counts as art. If it's carefully drawn. No, it's the purpose. It's the purpose behind why it is made. And that's not everything that looks like art is art. Some of it is practice. Some of it is a utility. Some of it is a product.
I would agree with that. You say art and art-like products, and I remember I bring this up all the time, like it's essentially kind of the same thing, where it's like there's art and then there are art's counterfeits. And I would think that a product would essentially, not really sure what I would classify, like art-like product would be something that just looks like it, but there's nothing behind it at all, which is what these AI generated images are. There's no emotion or feeling in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you can tell what it, you can see it because, like, again, I think that art is a language that people can understand. And if you don't speak the language, then you're going to think anything is art because it just looks cool to you.
Mm-hmm.
But when an artist who has a trained eye and who is experienced and has, you know, created a lot from their own personal experiences or how they perceive the world, and then when something like that comes in, you can see the emptiness in it. There's nothing behind it. Like, you can literally tell between something that has been handmade and then something that has been generated. It has this very empty, hollow, glossy plastic look. There's no life in it, despite there being a vibrancy to it. But if you don't speak the language, then obviously you're going to think that it looks like a piece of artwork. It's just a counterfeit.
And that's one of the things that I want to invite anyone watching this to consider when they're next time they look at art, or next time they read a book, or they listen to music, or consume any type of art, or experience any type of art. Think about what it is that you're responding to when you look at something and say, oh, I like that. Because one of the things that we did in my MFA, one of the biggest and most important things that you will do as a writer, as part of your coursework and study, and after even if you don't go to school, is if you're reading a book and you come across a passage that you like, you don't just go, oh, I like that, or oh, that's cool. You need to slow down and then think about why it is you responded to that passage. And so that will kind of start to inform you as to why that thing is effective. Because most of the time, I think when people are reading, they just go, oh, I'm crying now because this has made me sad. And they just think, oh, that's good. But they don't think about the artistry that went behind why that had the effect that it had.
You know, really,
or the technique.
You know, getting into it and, you know, feeling from it. You know, not everyone's going to have the same reaction, obviously, but, you know, there are certain things out there that just touch somebody's heart, and, you know, whether it's a subconscious thing or if they consciously know why it upset them, I think it is really important to observe and understand and take apart why something affected you the way that it did. I just think that's just better mental health in general, you know, not just for, you know, expanding your horizons and understanding what you like better and what you don't like, but, you know, it's also kind of coming to terms with who you are in a way, you know, and you discover what you dislike and like. And that's what I find about art. That's what I think about art, you know, as being this really wonderful thing that has so many different elements to it, but you can, no matter how it looks, you can still tell when there's like an emotion in something. And you can still feel it. And regardless of maybe you don't understand where it's coming from, there's something in it that you just sense. Not because it looks cool, but because there's something that it's saying. It is speaking to you in a way. And it may not speak to everybody, but when you feel something from what you have just reviewed, whether or not it's ugly or beautiful, there's something that the artist is saying. And it's usually from their own perspective of what they're viewing.
So, continuing in this, the reason that we create art provides us an outlet for expression, allowing us to turn thoughts, ideas, and feelings into something tangible or real. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I assume that you have, where you're listening to a song, maybe, and you got this vibe inside of you, and you're like, oh, I need to do something with that. I want to share this feeling that I just got with somebody somehow. And then it turns into telling a story, or it turns into a character. If you look at, I can say that behind all of the characters in the stories that I've written, I've had experiences or seen character journeys. Like, I wanted to show unconditional brotherly love. And that is how Ralph and Casey's story was born, because I can't translate it in another way. And so that's the way that those experiences and that expression was turned into something tangible for me to share with somebody else.
I can sit here and tell you exactly, but you never know what's going to inspire an artist, whether it's a song, whether it's something you've seen out in the open. I think Stephen King got the idea for it because he was walking down the street and a quarter fell in a drainage ditch, like in between a grate, and that's how he got the idea for it. You know, and I know I have completely been inspired by songs, and that's what I mean by it's a language that other artists understand. You get this vibe, and it communicates to you something kind of primordial, and you want to create because of it. You know, it inspires, regardless of if it may hurt you. There's something inspiring about certain things, and it gets you to think, or gets you to feel, and all those things are distinctly personal to you. I just think that's a really cool thing. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've heard it all the time with songs. Some songs I don't even understand why they inspired me, because they're so damn goofy, but
that eventually you translate it into a language that you can understand and then pass it on to someone else.
Yep, exactly.
Art is a communication tool. Many individuals use art to express their emotions in ways they don't feel comfortable putting into words or sharing with others. Ultimately, we create art to communicate our feelings, hopes, wishes, desires, even if just to ourselves. And I have this quote from Brian Masters that I always love from his book, Killing for Company, which is a true crime book about Dennis Nilsen. And he said, all of us conceal in conversations clues to personality, which we happily reveal on paper, because the added distance of writing lends protection and encourages the risks of intimacy. Which is a way of saying, because we're not directly talking to somebody, and like it's talking about letters, because Dennis Nelson would be more honest in letters when talking to him as opposed to when he was talking face to face. But we leave context clues or clues about ourselves in our art that we're not necessarily as aware of or feel as safe talking about.
I can get that way too. Sometimes I just have a hard time illustrating my thoughts because my brain just flies at the speed of light. But when I'm writing something, I can feel comfortable in knowing I'm able to slow down, think about what I'm going to say, and then write it out without stumbling or fumbling or, God forbid, something blowing up in my face because I got anxious and said something stupid when I was trying to say something nice. Like, that's happened so much before, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. But I understand what he means. It's like sometimes it's easier to just say things in like a letter or through texting than to openly talk about them.
Well, and you'll reveal parts of your personality in your art form that you're not necessarily going to show in real life. And again, that's not like a one for one, but it's like I may show more of that connection to broken families and to found families through the style of fiction that I write, because it constantly comes through as a theme. I might show a strong connection. Like if you look at everything that I do has an exaggeration to it.
Yeah.
And that'll expose things about how I view the world and interpret the world that you're not necessarily going to get through a conversation with me, because it's more the way that I think is exposed more through the way I communicate in art, because it's a rawer form of how I think.
Right. I agree with what you're saying there. And because there's no way to really ever disassociate yourself from what you're writing. I think that just personally, if you're completely disassociated from anything that you're doing, and you're just writing it to write it, I think that this is kind of makes a bad writer, in my opinion, because there's always going to be part of you that goes into what you're doing, whether you know it or not. There's probably things about me that, are going to get exposed or, seen, my own personality that I don't often show, when I'm in person, because you don't show all of yourself to somebody. But that rudimentary or this deep part of you that doesn't come in the open can be seen in the text, or how you view something, or how like a character might view something, or the questions that you ask, or the themes that you present. You don't start to notice a pattern until you look back and you notice it.
And that's going to be something that separates consumer product versus art. And that's not to say that art can't be commercially successful, but there is a difference between commercial art and then non-commercial art. And commercial art often follows a blueprint and is sold not for personal expression, but in order to fit a mold to feed a hunger. And so that's going to be less personal, because now you're making a product to feed for somebody else as opposed to for self-expression.
Well, the ghostwriters, there's a good example. They're not writing those stories to express themselves. They're doing it for money and to just
it's a product.
Follow this. Yeah, it's a product. Like James Patterson or whatever his name is. We all know that fucker's got like 30 different ghostwriters. Like, it's a brand. he's a brand, and there's no real depthful characterization or introspective nature to any of those stories. And yet there are mountains of them at any bookstore that you go to. And that's a product.
And I think that's where some people can get very confused between art and product, because you have stuff that looks the same, but it's not. You could say the same thing about like some movies that are more commercial, that follow a pattern or a formula, as opposed to others that then go more artistic. Like Del Toro is an artistic director, but then you have commercial directors that are usually like, oh, here is Cars 3, here is Cars 4, here is, and it's just all of these following in the franchises as remakes or sequels in order to make the money, because it's just a commercial product in order to fund the artistic endeavors.
Right. It's like the difference between Suspiria versus Star Wars. Both Suspirias are very experimental films. There's one from the 70s, and then there's one that came out in 2018, and both of them I think are excellent. One of them is very colorful, the other one's very bleak, but they're both an expression of artistic, value in some way from very artistic directors. But you get somebody that's just kind of there to get this done with because the studio needs to do this movie, or else their copyright's going to end, or the script's been sitting there forever. We need a quick buck. You see it with a lot of horror movies too. Like there are a lot of bad horror movies out there because they're there just to scratch an itch and then go on. There's nothing else to them that goes beyond them just scratching that itch, to get money.
So this brings us to the next thing that we were going to talk about, which is aesthetics-obsessed people have gotten so weird. Quote, video game characters should be so hot that people aspire to be hot. Okay, but what about you? Why aren't you hot? Aesthetics are supposed to be self-expressive, not a vehicle to impose your ideals onto other people. So this is something I've talked about previously with characters that designs being in existence to express that character. And I've talked about it in other videos that had people critiquing female appearances for not being good enough, and then just saying, hey, character appearances are designed for that expression of whatever. And I think in considering today's conversation, in some cases, you can even look at the ones where they are deliberately shoving certain things in your face. It is in protest to what the aesthetic people are saying, which is they must be pretty. And so you've got the protest against that, which is going the opposite direction. So like this has all become actually a conversation through artistic expression that people are saying is all political. I think that's actually just people are obstinate, honestly.
I think so too. I think it's in both terms political, because it's obstinance, and then some of it's political, and then some of it's just people who are very shallow, if you ask me. But do go on.
I first want to point out this guy right here with fiction does and should represent beauty and ideals that cannot exist in the real world. It has since ancient times. We consume art and fiction for that. If I wanted ugliness or the unideal, I'd stick to nonfiction. Number one, I'd like to point out this guy's Shadow the Hedgehog image. Apparently is an ideal really of beauty, funny. But for real, like you can have beauty in art, but it is not the only type of art. And we're going to talk about this next with aestheticism and aesthetic art specifically, because guess what? That is actually an artistic movement that happened in the Victorian era. And Oscar Wilde had something to say about the aesthetic movement. So what is actually being said here is I have a preference for aesthetic art. And that they're elevating their preference of an art style, of an art movement above others.
Yep.
Further down,
it is the ideal standard, because they are looking for something that is ideally reflected, and it's like that's some art is like that, and then other art isn't, and you can't sit here and say that it's just, this conversation is wild. You just read it.
There are two different types of ideal too, because you've got the I want to see ideal beauty, a thing to aspire to or to be hot. And then this also goes with the people that say you should only write characters that are moral, that are an ideal role model to aspire to. And if you write outside of that ideal, now you're writing immorally because you're portraying something immoral that should not be written that way. And then we get into morality plays, and that is a way to write, but it is not the only way to create a story.
Agreed. It's this weird idea, and we saw it with somebody else on the server months ago, and it was the discussion about ugly female game characters, and Aloy got brought up, which I don't know why everyone brings up Aloy, but I guess so. But he made this comment about ugly is evil. Essentially, that's what he was saying. Everything in between all of that, the bottom line of his argument was that ugly is evil, beauty is good.
Then we have this other conversation. We're going to see this guy a couple of times because I think it's important with what we've discussed so far. It's a damn ideal. People should strive for better, and works of art were made to show that idealized concept. Where's the inspiration, the spark to aim for the attractive and the strong? Because that's why people are like this, because they're flooded with the opposite. And the originator says, if an artist makes idealized work because that's an expression of their beliefs, self-expression, that is a non-issue. Telling people idealism is the purpose of art because you want the uglies in the world to, quote, better themselves to your standards is whack. Also, you first. And he continues, no, that's not. That's been a great focus of art for decades. I grow tired of no goddamn artistic standards, no attempt to make anything beyond the absolute bottom of the barrel. This sort of thinking is exactly what led to toilets being featured in an art museum. That's postmodern art. We'll talk about that in a bit. Art isn't just for you, which we've already covered. Art is an expression of the self, and then you can choose to be to go and see what that person is expressing or not, and you can like or dislike what that person is expressing, but art is an expression of the self.
Art, unless it is a commission, let's just put commissions aside. If somebody commissions you to do something, that's just what they would like you to do. But even still, they have hired you, for what you can do, right?
For your interpretation of what they would like you to interpret.
But all art, him saying art isn't just for you. Art is for the artist, because the artist is expressing themselves. And what, like you just said, you can like it, you cannot like it, but that doesn't mean that art isn't just for you. We're not saying that art is only for the artist, but it comes from them. We're out here writing books with no audience because we love doing it. I'm out here drawing pictures with I drew pictures for free for 20 years, not because I was, trying to make myself popular, but because I love to draw, because I wanted to express myself that way. It's not about this. I don't know where this idea comes from, except for what you mentioned, aestheticism. And they think that they're the objective standard. I'm just like, I want to like not ban the word, but I hate the word objective at this point. I used to be one of those people who really did believe in the idea of objective anything. And it's like, but then I started thinking about it and I'm like, this is becoming such a much more complicated thing when objectivity really is just simple. It's to identify something. That's how I view it. But this dude right here is just saying some whack shit. Like, that one person was absolutely right too. It was,
with more from what he said, artists should be making the attractive, the idealized, the over-the-top, and more, at least more should. Escapism and just idealized depictions to inspire people. Art isn't just for your own ego, it's for an audience to enjoy, and for that to evoke something in their hearts. I'm just tired of this insistence that we shouldn't strive for better, as if making art is an attack on the ugly by its very nature. Artistry should be a process of betterment, refining the atmosphere, the expression, and the unique soul up to the work, for others to enjoy. Art isn't an island purely for one's own ego and nothing more. It's for giving people a reason to strive for more, to lift their souls, to make them feel something. You play for the world, enjoy making it, but have some standard for crying out loud. And when every work does it for decades, what does that say? When you break every case and destroy every sculpture, twisting and corroding it, what does that say? Because it's what's been occurring for years in games, films, and especially art. Of course, I want something different. It's a difference between this and that, like when you're portraying something you meant to evoke. What on earth is the second image character trying to evoke? Ugly for the sake of it, with no exploration at all, which I hate that they keep bringing up Fable 4 because nobody knows what the story of Fable 4 is. So
no, they don't.
What's the purpose of her looking like this? Well, why don't you wait for the story to come out and find out?
But the problem is like when he's saying that, like when you were like, oh, like it's like the difference between this and this, like when you portray something you meant to evoke. I'm like, you do not know what the intention of this character is because there's no frame of reference for it yet. There's no story. You have the biggest ego coming out your ass right now, dude, because you do not know what this is going to be. You don't. And it's like you're casting aspersions on something based on your own experiences and want to sit here and tell the rest of us how to do something because you think we need to idealize life. And I'm sorry, but that is bullshit. It's like we're supposed to be the audience. Well, when you're an artist and you don't have an audience, you got to earn one if you want one. But some people drew pictures for years and were unnoticed completely. I know an incredible artist who worked on Chester Cheetah, and nobody knows him, but he's a phenomenal artist and he works as a working artist. He's incredible, but nobody knows him. That's his job. He doesn't have an audience. Art isn't just specifically for an audience. And this guy is trying to say that, like, well, it's not just for you, it's for us too. I'm like, but that depends on what you like.
And it's for you to experience the thing that I want to show you. You don't have to like the thing that I show you. But the experience, if I make an artistic piece that I make public, it is for you to experience what I am trying to convey. And then you can pass judgment on if you like it or not. So like if you can pass judgment on the story of Fable, whether you like it or not, but you're still experiencing the creator's thing. Further down here, you don't need to make every single thing hyper beautiful. Contrast, I think, is important. But he acts as if there has been no beautiful art whatsoever for decades. But they intentionally just scrub away beauty in any form, arguing that beauty itself is an attack on what isn't. That beauty itself should never be strived for, as if it couldn't be real. And I call BS on this because I follow so many artists all the time. There are artists everywhere creating. There are beautiful characters in games. I'm going to go to my profile here really quick.
Oh my gosh, please. Like,
just
one,
to show, like,
images, you know, those are gorgeous.
I can disprove there's no beautiful art just by the people that I've hired to make me art in the last year.
Yeah.
But here's a young artist, contemporary art made by a young artist. I can one image, I can already prove that this guy is not a consumer or viewer of art, because he's saying for decades there's been no beauty. Oh, look, a young artist, contemporary art. Young artist, contemporary art.
Oh, I followed them on Twitter. They were wonderful artists.
Contemporary art. And I also responded with this because art takes on different forms. And when I think of, you need to make something beautiful, you need to make it ideal. I think of Bodymore because Bodymore is specifically not a beautiful version of Baltimore. It's a scary, haunted version of Baltimore. And you get that especially through the graffiti that is often vulgar, specifically because it puts it more on edge. It tells you more of the raw emotions. And so then, like, I got a quote here from Bodymore Zero where it's some graffiti that says, "Where are you? I feel you. Bitch, stop hitting on me. The only kind of hit is dead. Bitch, bitch, bitch."
I laughed at that too. I was like, you're like, them art should be beautiful, refined atmosphere, process of betterment. There's only one kind of art, me. And then you show that, I freaking cackled, dude. I was like,
Now, for me, the betterment comes in watching these characters or a betterment, because I write hope. I write eventual hope, but not everybody writes hope. A lot of people write tragedies. Some people just write absolute tragedy in order to have the catharsis at the end, because it's not a process of betterment or refined atmosphere or beauty. There are different reasons behind it.
My therapist told me, you're getting something out of the misery. I'm like, I guess I am.
So then I want to read this letter by Oscar Wilde that he put in a picture of Dorian Gray, and it is on aestheticism. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. For those who find beautiful things or beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of the Caliban seeing his own face in the glass. The 19th century's dislike of romanticism is the rage of the Caliban not seeing his own face in the glass. The moral life of a man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy is an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for the art. From the point of view of form, the type of all arts is the art of a musician. From the point of view of feelings, the actor's craft is the type. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbols do so at their peril. It is the spectator, not life, that art really mirrors. The diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useful thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
Good old Oscar Wilde, huh? That's really interesting, and it's a response to this.
So aestheticism, late 19th century European artist movement, which centered the doctrine that art exists for the sake of its beauty alone and that it need to serve no political, didactic, or other purpose. The movement began in reaction to prevailing utilitarian social philosophies and to what was perceived as the ugliness and Philistinism of the industrial age. Its philosophical foundations were laid in the 18th century by Immanuel Kant, who postulated the anatomy of aesthetic standards, setting them apart from consideration of morality, utility, and pleasure. The idea was then amplified by a couple of different people. It was popularized in France and by a philosopher later, and coined a later phrase, art for art's sake, in 1818. So when you say art is useless on this, the aesthetic movement believed the only point in art was to be beautiful.
Yeah, and to be inspiring.
Art for art's sake.
Mm-hmm. So that's what Oscar Wilde doesn't really think that art is useless. It's just a response to that. Like, art is whatever it is. He's cheeky. He's very cheeky.
I mean, if you looked at not just a picture of Dorian Gray, which is about somebody who is aesthetic constantly on the outside and hiding the ugly on the back end, pretending to be something that he's not, then you have The Importance of Being Earnest, which is also by Oscar Wilde.
It's really interesting with the whole Dorian Gray thing, where you said, because I've never read Dorian Gray. I'm familiar with it, I know it's about a guy named Dorian Gray who does not age, but the picture of him does, apparently. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yep. So anytime Dorian actually takes damage, like say he cuts his face, or does something happens to him, I think he actually catches on fire at some point. It's been a while since I've read it, but I think he's theoretically supposed to get burn scars at some point. And instead of it happening to him, it happens to the portrait. And so as he technically goes through the years, and he's supposed to age, Dorian looks the same. And if you go into his attic where the picture is, you see everything that should happen to him happening to the picture.
It's reflecting himself on the inside, the ugliness of him on the inside, and as well as the outside, because of all the evil things he does throughout the novel. But the idea is that he's like making this comment on, because it's beautiful, therefore it's good. But just because it's beautiful doesn't, on the inside, it's not. It's the same thing what Carl Jung says with the shadow self, with the more light we are on the outside, the darker and deeper we are on the inside. If we don't acknowledge our deepest, darkest parts of ourselves, it gets denser and blacker without acknowledging it. You have to be able to understand kind of what you are on the inside to tame the beast. And in that way, you have come to better understand yourself to be an appropriate member of society, in a sense. And people are saying, what I've been hearing people say constantly, is that art has to be beautiful, it has to be idealistic, we have to strive to look a certain way, because it's the artist's job to do that for us. For some reason, we just can't do it on our own. The art's got to do that for us. It's got to inspire us to do that. But just because something is beautiful does not mean that it is a good thing. There are a lot of people out there who are very good looking, and they can be some of the most horrible people there are. Beauty is just not indicative of personality.
That's one of the reasons why in my work, I do it with Matthias in Dead End Drive, and it's in Creatures Lie Here with Dimitri. It goes off of the idea that Satan was the most beautiful angel, or Lucifer was the most beautiful angel, but he was also had the ego that had him cast away from God, because he wanted to be equal to God and he wanted his own worshipers, but he was the most beautiful.
Yes.
And so I constantly use that in my own work, which some of these people in these conversations about art then take the idea of, oh, you made the evil person beautiful as a damnation of art, or of beauty, but it's not generally that straightforward.
No, it's not, because there is the quote, I can't remember where in the world or what passage and book it is in the Bible, but Satan will appear to you as an angel of light. And really that's metaphorical for drugs might seem like a good idea. They may look beautiful to you. Horrible things might seem like a good idea in your head. There's something alluring about it, right? And you don't know how bad it is until you get in it. And whatever you thought was beautiful has now just crumbled into this disgusting filth. So I really can't stand this argument of like beauty equal good, ugly equal evil.
After careful scrutiny, he concludes all art is quite useless. In this one sentence, Wilde encapsulates the complete principle of the aesthetic movement popular in the Victorian England. That is to say, real art takes no part in molding the social or moral identities of society, nor should it. Art should be beautiful and pleasure its observers, but to imply further reaching influence would be a mistake. The explosion of the aesthetic philosophy in England society, as exemplified by Oscar Wilde, was not confined merely to art. Rather, the proponents of this philosophy extended it to life itself. Here, aestheticism advocated whatever behavior was likely to maximize the beauty and happiness in one's life in the tradition of hedonism. To the aesthetic, the ideal life mimics art. It is beautiful, but quite useless beyond its beauty, concerned only with the individual living it. Influences on others, if existent, are trivial at best. Many have read A Picture of Dorian Gray as novelized sponsor for just that sort of aesthetic lifestyle. However, this story and the rise and fall of Dorian Gray might instead represent an allegory about morality meant to critique rather than endorse the obeying of one's impulses as thoughtlessly and dutifully as aestheticism dictates. To interpret the novel as a patent recommendation for aestheticism, to the aesthetic, there is no distinction between moral or immoral acts, only between those that increase or decrease one's happiness. Yet Dorian Gray refutes that idea, presenting a strong case for the inherent immorality of purely aesthetic lives. Dorian Gray personifies the aesthetic lifestyle in action, pursuing personal gratification with abandon. Yet, while he enjoys the indulgences, his behavior ultimately kills him and others, and he dies unhappier than ever. Rather than an advocate for pure aestheticism, Dorian Gray is a cautionary tale in which Wilde illustrates the dangers of the aesthetic philosophy where not practiced with prudence. Aestheticism, argues Wilde, is too often aligns itself with immorality, resulting in the precarious philosophy that must be practiced deliberately. So where it's the pursuits of only aestheticism and nothing else but aestheticism matters, it causes
and it's just kind of empty
the downfall. Yeah, it causes the downfall and destruction of everything because you're just doing everything for beauty's sake and you're chasing after it, which is, if you look at some of my videos from the past talking about this with the female characters that are only about beauty, it is removed, disassociated from the purpose of telling a story, from the purpose of the character, and it is turned only into an aesthetic that it becomes destructive.
Yeah, because if you're just doing that for the sake of one, other people, and two, to make it look beautiful, there is a vapidness in that. There is something so empty about it because there's no real expression from the artist. It's like strive to be better, strive to make us feel like we can do better. It's like you don't know what is going to affect somebody at any time. And, honestly, that's how certain music movements kind of came about. Like grunge was a response to the hair metal bands of the 80s because it was becoming this superfluous, superficial, environment that was not speaking to them as a generation, essentially. Where they were feeling sad and down collectively. They weren't getting anything from this music. And so eventually the pendulum swung back. And then that's how we ended up with like Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, then that, transitioned into we getting Linkin Park and MCR and Evanescence. And like everything is a response to something. And if there's too much of one thing, there will be a reaction to that to go the other way. So what they're demanding is that everything be beautiful, but at some point it will become everything needs to be ugly because the artists are going to get fed up with seeing stuff that does not speak to them in a way, and they're not allowed to express themselves the way they want to express themselves because they have to fit a criteria that has been determined by not the artist, but the audience that wants it from them. So they're not really there for you. They're not there for your thoughts or your opinions or the way you interpret something. They're there because you delivered something to them that they think they deserve and that they want you to rinse and repeat the same thing over and over and over again to appease them. Basically, dance, monkey, dance.
Well, so then this goes back into the idea of aestheticism and the aesthetic movement connecting to the revolutionary period, because during the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolutionary period, where things were being mechanized, where things were going onto the production line to be mass produced. And so that actually comes into the idea of the aesthetic movement here, where Oscar Wilde proposed that the principles of the aesthetic movement extended beyond the production of mere commodities because of the Industrial Revolution. In Joseph Pierce's biography, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, Pierce recalls Wilde's own perspective on the popular movement. Speaking of aestheticism, Wilde is quoted, "It is indeed to become a part of people's life. I mean, a man who works with his hands, and not with his hands merely, but with his head and his heart. The evil that machinery is doing is not merely in the consequences of its work, but in the fact that it makes man themselves machines also. Whereas we wish them to be artists, that is to say, men." So this idea of falling into the aesthetics, of creating this ideal thing, and that is the standard, which goes into this idea also of an objective storytelling, objective art, which is beautiful. If you hit these check boxes, and that is what it is, you are creating a product to turn artists and people into machines in order to create that ideal. Down here it says, in his exposition of aestheticism, Wilde applies the philosophy in a more universal sense, stressing the positive influences of aestheticism in one's life beyond mere craftsmanship. Just as the machines that mass-produce materials with the invention of human thought are labeled evil, Wilde similarly condemns men who act as a metaphorical machine programmed to behave in accordance with society's ideas of propriety, rather than allowing themselves to act freely and achieve the greatest amount of happiness. Wilde eloquently advocates advocacy of an aesthetic lifestyle is paralleled in his depictions of Lord Henry and Dorian Gray. Lord Henry lectured to the impressionable Dorian, "We are punished for our refusal. Every refusal that we strive to strangle, brood in the mind and poison us. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things that it has forbidden itself." Wilde, through Lord Henry, laments the stifling nature of his contemporary Victorian society and how the supposed morality it boasts necessitates self-denial and rejection of life's most beautiful aspects. Lord Henry warns that without an enthusiastic embrace of aestheticism, one will perpetually anguish with the desire precisely that he must deny himself, all for the sake of propriety. The philosophy espoused by Wilde and Lord Henry, which often, not surprisingly, to the conclusion of Dorian Gray, is the declaration of Wilde promoting the adoption of purely aesthetic lives without qualification. That is, this, however, is too shallow of an interpretation. Opponents of the purely aesthetic lifestyle will certainly cite that they consider an inevitability, one's desire and impulses, though when acted upon result in a more pleasurable life, will at times be undeniably immoral. It is at these times that the virtues of the holy aesthetic life become questionable. The ruination of Dorian Gray, the embodiment of unbridled aestheticism, illustrate the immorality of such a lifestyle and gravely demonstrate its consequences. Wilde uses Dorian Gray not as an advertisement for aestheticism, but rather he uses Dorian's life to warn against aestheticism's hostility towards morality when uncontrolled. Wilde himself admits in a letter to the St. James Gazette that Dorian Gray is a story with a moral, and the moral is this: all excess, as well as the ruination, brings its own punishment. Aestheticism does well to condemn the ruination of desires, but it is an excessive obedience to these desires that it is subversively dangerous. Therefore, in practice of Wilde's aestheticism, forethought and constraint are necessities, yet too often lacking, and without them, one is doomed to suffer the same fate as Dorian Gray. So pretty much anything taken to an extreme is going to destroy.
Yes, because too much of anything is never a good thing.
Wanting to look at beautiful things, wanting beautiful characters or beautiful stories or beautiful art, having aesthetic art is great, but all art does not need to be aesthetic.
No, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. And also, what is determined to be aesthetic to one person is really not going to be an aesthetically pleasing thing to somebody else. Some people really like ugly looking art.
But see, that comes down to the subject of self-expression. If we go way back to the beginning of this conversation, is some people want to express beauty without politics. They want to say, yes, I saw this beautiful woman at the market and I want to make the most gorgeous version of her in marble to show the world the beauty that I experienced.
Yes.
Some people want to do that, and that is perfectly fine. Other people want to do a story that is not about just absolute beauty.
Yeah. And because again, too much of anything is never a good thing. Like, even if it's like too much water can kill you if you drink it, and the same thing applies for this. It does, and it will become vapid and shallow if this is the standard that has been determined by a group of people that prefer aestheticism over expressionism, or whatever you want to refer to, whatever art style you're in, and think that that is what people need to aspire to. And so you're essentially forcing people, or in the mindset, you think it's okay to force people to do what you want based on your own preferences because you just don't like to look at quote unquote ugly things.
And in here he eventually meets an actress named Sybil, and he falls for her when she is on stage because he's seeing her act in a certain way. He's seeing her be beautiful on stage. However, when she comes off of stage, stops playing that character, he doesn't like her anymore because she's not performing that beautiful art. And what he actually says to Sybil is, without your art, you are nothing. Because he's not looking at her as the person or the experience. He's looking at the idealized version of her, the aesthetic that he is drawn to.
This reminds me of a friend of mine, because we've talked before about people who put other people on an idealized pedestal. And then when they get to know that person, the pedestal that they have placed this person upon crumbles like nobody's business. That has happened to my friend before so many times because they have determined that she needs to be a specific way, but when she doesn't meet the criteria of what they decided they wanted for her to be, it all just comes crashing down. And the same thing this reminds me of that. It's like you have this idealistic perception of another person that you don't even really know. And so it's the same thing where they say, don't meet your heroes. Is they're not going to be who you think they are.
Further down, you have Dorian, whose uncontrolled aestheticism rejects the concept of morality. The morality of his actions goes unrecognized, and so his evil is not seen. In fact, Dorian declares excitedly, "It seems to me to be simply like a wonderful ending to a wonderful play. It has all the terrible beauty of a Greek tragedy, a tragedy in which I took great part in, but by which I have not yet been wounded." Here, the adverse consequences of aestheticism surface in Dorian's life. In his pursuit of his own pleasures, a distinctly narcissistic attitude emerges, and the incompatibility of morality and unconditional aestheticism becomes all the more apparent. The emergence of narcissism in Dorian and its correlation with his newly adopted aesthetic philosophy is integral to Wilde's novel, as it emphasizes the frequent hostility between aestheticism and morality that Wilde cautions against, which you see come into play when people are like, demonizing anything that is not beautiful.
Exactly. Or what they
of beauty.
Yeah. And again, obviously there's certain things. We also talked about this too. All right. It's all about what you might find subjectively attractive. I can objectively say that Brad Pitt is a handsome man, but I can say that I'm just not attracted to him. I think Jake Gyllenhaal is more attractive. They're both handsome, but I find one of them more attractive than the other. And so the standard that they're trying to apply is really ridiculous. It's like they're equating it to, if you're not making something beautiful, you must have a problem with beauty. No, not at all. I don't have an issue with things that are beautiful. I love things that are beautiful. There are things that I find beautiful. There's some weird shit that I find beautiful, and I can't even tell you why. This idea of saying that we are making some sort of a statement or implying that we're making a protest about not wanting to make beautiful things, or some of us aren't making what they would classify as beautiful, is absolute absurdity. And they think everything is some sort of an attack.
Dorian Gray exposes the immorality of self-absorption as Dorian's portrait becomes more disfigured with each one of Dorian's selfish acts. This self-absorption then appears to be an inevitable consequence of aestheticism. Only the more deliberate practice of aestheticism may harness the egotism and avoid the immorality that Dorian embodies. Interestingly, in his essay, Come See About Me, Enchantment of Dorian and the Picture of Dorian Gray, Christopher Kraft recognizes the mirroring of the Greek myth of Narcissus in the life of Dorian Gray. According to Greek mythology, Narcissus, upon catching a glimpse of his own reflection in a pool, becomes so enraptured by it that he stood and admired it endlessly, unmoving for the rest of his life. As Kraft notes, his self-absorption is a commitment that, like Dorian, graduates fully until death. Again, it's saying that there is nothing wrong with being interested in beauty. There's nothing wrong with aestheticism, but you have to keep it in check, or else you become fully egotistical, fully narcissistic, and only wanting to see what you see as beautiful, and then becoming separate from morality, from experiences of others, from compassion, because you only become focused on what is beautiful, and beauty is morality, which in reality it's not.
Not at all. There's some ugly things out there that are, take an animal for example. There are some ugly looking animals that are very, very friendly, but then you have these beautiful, colorful, vibrant animals, but they're dangerous and they'll mess you up. So it's like, really, beauty is just not a morality thing. And I don't know where this, where they have gotten this from, other than somebody's just talked to them about them. I understand that it's aestheticism, but what I don't understand is where it came from, other than the fact they were a bunch of angry nerds who are tired of seeing girls that are just kind of flat-chested.
I think it just becomes what Oscar Wilde is pointing out with Dorian Gray, where it starts out in a good place, where you like that thing. But if you don't harness what it is that you are imbibing in, and if you just continually lean into it, as with anything, you can like alcohol, but if you don't harness it, then you can become an alcoholic.
Same with drugs.
Yep, and same with food, and same with pretty much anything. Is too much of something without harness, without restraint. Leaning into hedonism is going to destroy you. And that is still a risk, even with choice styles of art, and then saying this is the only way. So the aesthetic movement in England, as interpreted by Oscar Wilde, revolves around the ideal that the utility of one's actions should be to create the maximal amount of beauty and pleasure in one's life and nothing more. It's hedonistic. Wilde's Dorian Gray appears at first glance to promote this philosophy unequivocally. Indeed, the lifestyle based on this aestheticism is espoused in Wilde's opening preface, as well as throughout Lord Henry's professorial lectures. Upon closer inspection, however, Wilde's novel is not as wholly embracing aestheticism as this implies. Wilde realized and depicted in the life of Dorian Gray a need for more controlled and deliberate approach to aestheticism, without which morality will inevitably be elusive. So you cannot fully lean into aestheticism and say it is the only way and remain moral.
Right, because then at what point does the aestheticism become something that is completely immoral?
Yep.
By a certain standard. Because it could be like glorifying, pedophilia or something like that, and that's what the objective standard is now in the aestheticism, is just pedophilia.
Well, and then that would come from somebody saying, what is the ideal appearance of beauty? And then you go, well, it's 21, well, it's 18, and it becomes whatever the consensus of that group decides is the ideal of beauty.
Yeah, it does. And another thing too, I've just noticed with a certain group of people who they're saying that like 21 and then 18, there's some people who are saying that 16 is the ideal beauty standard now, when it's like I look at a 16-year-old girl and I just see a child. But for some reason, people like to try and use, science to back this up by saying that, oh, well, girls are more fertile whenever they're young, right? And then it becomes a political issue because for some reason it's become political to have an appearance. And they say that if the younger you are, the more fertile, the better you are. And the reason they say this is because they think that they can sort of manipulate and train what they're getting from these people to be what they want them to be, but not who they are. And that's what I have a problem with this aestheticism thing. I don't have an issue with whatever people like, unless it's you're committing some sort of a crime, like what you're gonna like, right? I can't stop you. I'm not gonna say that I like it or condone it in any way if it is actually bad, but I can't stop you. Doesn't mean that I'm not gonna have an opinion, doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have an opinion. And the determining factor, really, there is no determining factor from any objective standard that doesn't come from a group of people. And that is a personal preference that they have all mutually agreed on is what is their standard. But when I was talking about it earlier, about when you say you're from one of these groups that has determined that the objective standard of beauty is X, Y, and Z, then you leave that group and go to another group and they collectively say, no, the standard of beauty is X, Y, Z. Which group is objective now? Because it sounds like the way they group it as, or the way they talk about it, is the majority vote is the objective reality, essentially. So what happens when you leave that group and go into another one? They're the group majority against what you believe in. So who is objective at that point? And it just falls flat on its face whenever they try to do stuff like this. You can't contain self-expression. You can't demand from people that they dance for you because you're unhappy with certain aspects that aren't even coming from most of these people.
And in some cases, like if you think about what that actually means, it's somebody asking others to create their form of self-expression instead of making it themselves.
Yes.
That's really what it comes down to, because like I wanted to figure out how to share what I saw more. Also, I'm obsessed with my own characters. So I started to learn how to draw, but I also can't draw the way that I want, which means I have to hire other people to also help me fully achieve what I'm trying to envision. But I create the kinds of stories that I want to read more of. And I don't go to other people and demand, you need to make my stories for me. I go, I'm going to share the things that I love and the things that I want to express.
It's funny that you say that, because you know who else has said that before? Jenna Moresi has said that she wants to write the books that she wants to read. And I think people have a really big problem with that. And I think there's a lot of people out there who think that she needs to write a certain way for them, when it's like Jenna's going to do whatever Jenna's going to do. And you ain't going to stop her. All right. That's just been proven.
Look,
and you're not going to stop any of these other people either.
Nobody has asked for the kinds of characters of the stories that I'm telling, but you know what?
No.
I'm going to freaking do my best to convince you to read them, maybe.
Same. It's like, I hate this idea of, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But I hate this idea of, because I see it too, it's like how to create the relatable character. I'm just like, that is so impossible. And then they become vapid and empty because there's nothing there for anybody to latch onto. It just becomes a projection, right? And there's no personality or personal journey within that character. I see it all the time. Like I remember seeing, and I swear I don't know if this was a joke or if this was satire, because I sometimes jokes fly over my fucking head. I don't know why. Unfortunately, it just is a fact. But this girl said, in order to create a good character, a good main character, you have to make the character like the reader, which I think is bullshit. And I'm just like, I don't know if you're being serious or if this is satire or what, but it's just, you can't quantify that kind of reaction. You cannot control the response you get from people. That is just impossible. In fact, what's the first thing you want to do when someone demands you do something for them? The knee-jerk response is to, no, I'm not going to do it because you've eliminated my choice. people don't like not having a choice. And when you eliminate the choices from people and you dictate what they need to do, it is going to backfire on you so unbelievably bad that what you wanted in the first place is going to be completely different and not going to go your way. It is a fruitless battle.
I mean, you don't have to go even that far with, if you give me a story and you have this character and tell me everybody likes this character, she is the greatest, she is the nicest. I'm like, freaking don't tell me how to feel about this.
Right?
Show me the character. And maybe the other characters can comment on how they feel, but don't talk to me about how I should feel about the character.
Yeah, a lot of times it's like, dude, I feel like you're lying to me because you say she's all these things, but this bitch is doing the exact opposite of what you said she is. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you feel like you're being gaslit or something, and you're like, wait a second, I don't know what this is.
So to finish off this article, the adoption of unrestrained aestheticism, as exhibited by Dorian, results in a lack of remorse, self-absorption, and intellectual regression. For the sake of preserving morality, a concept proven incapable with pure aestheticism, more deliberation is necessary from the aesthetic in deciding upon action. If, in pursuit of one's desires and of beauty, the beautiful aspects of life, the conditions of others or of one's own intellect is in jeopardy, the enjoyment garnered must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. As Wilde makes clear, it is only through a more restrained philosophy that aestheticism and morality may eventually align. And again, that is just saying restraint is necessary. You do not get a more full life by only pursuing aesthetics and making beauty equal to morality. By declaring beauty as morality and in the pursuit of only beauty, you lose morality and you regress intellectually.
Yeah, you become obsessive, right? You become obsessive and everything else around you stops mattering.
Yep, and that's the only thing that you analyze, which we get into, like the reference to the Fable 4 character. They don't know what the frick that character actually means in her story.
No, and I think
I've looked it up, and every article I've seen has said there's not much information about Fable 4 yet.
I think that is just to kind of illustrate what the game is going to look like, perhaps. But they see it as an unattractive woman, but the joke might be that she's unattractive and she might be fucking hilarious. And there might be jokes about her not being attractive. So since we're on the topic of attractive and beauty, let's talk about art that is not what we would refer to as beautiful, you know,
because it's a form of expression and expressing emotions, expressing experiences, and experience, obviously, and sometimes it's beauty, and in this case it is experiences of schizophrenia. And so these are all just different images by different people that are said to have schizophrenia and their expressions of what schizophrenia feels like through artistic measures. And also, since these are all from different people, you can see a varying levels of artistic ability. And because some have more skill or more technical skill behind them than others, it does not mean they are more or less art, because the amount of skill put into something is not what makes it art. However, skill does come into, or technique, that deliberate technique does come into what makes something art.
Yes. But also another thing too, looking at these images, they're all emphatically different from each other, but they all, you know, in different skill levels, but they all convey a meaning of unrest and duality existing in the mind of a schizophrenic, you know, the delusions that they feel, the demon that they feel they are, the emptiness in some cases, you know, just I'm a door, you know, just sucking in everything around me that just makes no sense. It's like there doesn't seem to be a sense of knowing who they are with all of those images. But they feel like they're kind of, that's what I'm getting from this, like being stranded with your demons and never being able to escape them because they can speak to you. They can show things to you,
or they're attached to you, or you're trapped where you are. So like, and generally, like, you could say these are beautiful in the way that they express emotion, but they're not aesthetic if you're in the pursuit of beauty. And so if you are only in the pursuit of aesthetic movement, of the aesthetic art, you would lose out on expressions and experiences like this, because these aren't considered beautiful.
No. They would not fit the criteria for aestheticism, because they're not actually promoting anything beautiful. They're promoting something just that's absolutely horrible.
And it's not even promoting, it's expressing.
Expressing, not promoting, excuse me, wrong choice of word. Expressing an a discontent with themselves, expressing unrest, expressing distress and sorrow and fear. Those are not pretty things.
Which takes me back to this person and any of the commentary that says art should only be beautiful. Art should be an ideal. It dismisses every type of expression and says that there is only one way that is appropriate to express yourself and everything else is evil. And the point of what, like we were saying in general, is there are different types of ways to express yourself. There are different styles, and none is better than the other. You can personally choose to like aestheticism. You can personally pursue that as your favorite of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But it does not have to be the only one. And
exactly.
As an artist and somebody who looks at art all the time myself and reads all the time and different things, I constantly am just confused by these people that say that there is nothing else out there but ugliness, when I'm looking at beauty all the time.
I am too. And it's like, remember, it was Adam from Your Movie Sucks, and he said you can tell these people have a very limited and poor media diet. They don't do the legwork that it takes to find the things they like. They need to be spoon-fed their media. They can't find it on their own. And so they make these assumptions, which are really baseless, because if you look all around you, there is wonderful art everywhere, wonderful storytellers everywhere. And all they do is find something that is being talked about the most because it's got a bunch of money behind it, or like Marvel, DC, all these things have become very product-like. I can't agree with them on that. And then they assume that because of this, that means everything else is also ugly and empty, and they're not getting anything out of it. They feel insulted by it. And it's like, if you looked around at all the beautiful art, it makes you wonder, what do you consider art then? Because I see beautiful art everywhere of varying degrees. Like, even if those schizophrenic pictures were not what we refer to as like a traditionally beautiful thing, I found them to be breathtakingly, profoundly beautiful in their ugliness.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was honesty. And I think that is beautiful, to be honest about something. And it's not always pretty.
And that's a different interpretation of beauty than what is under the aestheticism, which is to drive toward an ideal, to always be refining to be better. But that's not what the interpretation of somebody's experiences as being beautiful, despite how terrifying they are.
Yes.
You're finding the expression and that connection with the human experience beautiful, not beauty for beauty's sake.
Exactly. That it's the idea of individualism that I find beautiful. And I can see beauty in anything, even if it's not what we refer to as the aesthetically beautiful thing, the ideal beauty, from what these people are like saying needs to be ideal. It is the expression. Even if all those people have schizophrenia, you can still see their individual identities in every single one of those pictures. And that's what I think is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think uniqueness and distinctness and people being who they are, beautiful. And that's complicated because people are messy. Life is messy. It is not life by anybody's terms. It is life by life's terms. And there is nothing that, there's a lot of things in life that are not ideal. But we have been given, there was a quote last night from 11/22/63, excuse me. And where she was reading that poem where it said, we have been given pain to be astounded by joy. And I think that there needs to be that contrast there, because we're not going to be able to define what is, painful if we don't go through painful ordeals. And if this person is saying you can't express yourself the way that you need to, you're going to be an empty and angry person.
Mm-hmm.
I think. Because you have to be able to express yourself, and just because they don't like it, it's like no one's saying that you have to look at any of this. That's the beautiful thing about art in general. You can pick and choose what you like. And I think it's really freaking funny that it's coming from people who are not artists, by the way. They don't write, they don't draw, they just consume. That doesn't mean that anybody who consumes art and they don't draw or write does not mean that they can't understand what an artist is getting at. They just might not be able to do any of those things. But these people clearly don't fucking get it.
Some of it, I wonder if it stops people not knowing how to respond, because like you mentioned earlier, some of the objective stuff is about being able to say I'm right and you're wrong.
Yes.
And that's it. And then if you say it, because I've had this happen in other situations, I had it in conversation with Sam Fenna when I was like, this is how I'm interpreting your book. And he was like, well, that's not what I mean. And I'm like, that's fine. I understand this is not what you were going for, or like whatever, but this is how I'm interpreting it. And it's okay that we have different opinions. It's okay, because
Right.
that's what happens with art. And he was like, I don't know how to respond to that. That's because you can't, because it's an interpretation, it's an opinion. And I think that in some cases with this, well, I need my preferences are objectively correct. I can tell you that yours are objectively worse. And if you say, okay, that's fine, but that's an opinion, there's nothing that you can respond to with that to prove that the other person is incorrect. And I think that stumps some people.
That gets their goat. That didn't just stump them, it makes them mad. This idea of objective storytelling, which objectivity in art is bullshit, but it came at a response. It was an emotional response that he had to people saying, this is my opinion. People saying, disclaimer, this is what I think. He has an issue with that because he thinks that if you're going to say something, you need to prove that you're right. And sometimes it's not about being right. In fact, most of the times it isn't about being right. It's just about what you experience. And for some reason, there's this disconnect of people who don't get it. It's like, I'm sorry, but you cannot sit here and tell me that I have the wrong feelings I do whenever I interpreted something. And I can understand it's frustrating. You know, if you see one thing, it feels like everyone else is seeing something else. Like, I can understand how frustrating that is, but that is you. And maybe you might give something a different, another chance. Maybe I did interpret this wrong, but the bottom line is you just might not like it, and that's okay. But these people cannot stand when someone says they like what they dislike, and then they will try and browbeat you into submission when they say, oh, well, was this done? And they prove their points, or they try to illustrate their points, and they're very compelling, and they speak in authoritative tones. But
even when you say, when you do like that, though, you can even say, I understand where you're coming from, but I didn't get that, which is fine. You can still say, oh, now that you've explained that to me, I can see why you made that connection. Yes. But it may not change the connection that I made. Sometimes it can, sometimes it doesn't. Either way is fine.
But him coming in here with this objective thing, it's like, no, you're just trying to be right. If we're, like I said before, if we're going to objectively look at something and try to discuss something objectively, we're just going to talk about the objective facts about it, which is the sky blue? Yes. Is the grass green? Yes. What kind of conversation are you going to have when you're trying to discuss a movie? Is it a movie? Yes. Were there actors in it? Yes. Did they act? Yes. Those are objective things. Was there music? Yes. There's no conversation to be had. And whether or not you think something was poorly done is entirely up to you. People love Neil Breen films. Those movies are god awful. I mean, god awful, but people love them. And it's the sincerity from Neil Breen himself that people are attracted to. They may like and prefer to watch a Neil Breen film to get the laughs out of it and make fun of it more than they would watch something that is compelling and touching and well acted, well designed, well lit, blah, blah, blah. It does not matter. When we talk about timelessness, right? I showed you that GIF of Godzilla flying in, on his back. He's clearly on a wire, and it's so goofy looking, but people love it. Godzilla has been around forever, and it's not because something looks good that makes it timeless. There's something in it that struck the heart of a bunch of people that kept it alive. That comes from emotion, not an objective quality thing. It's just pointless to argue that.
The last thing that I want to discuss today regarding art is what is postmodern art? Because a lot of the time in these conversations, you hear people say specifically modern art has ruined things. We hate modern art because modern art is all ugly. And upon further inspection of modern art and post-modern art and what those things mean, I think all of these people generally mean postmodern art when they're insulting modern art. And so I want to get into it with you guys. Oh, I also wanted to invite the comments. Let me know what your guys' thoughts specifically are on what causes people to think they have to browbeat others because of an opinion. Not even that you just can't, because I'm interested in what is the social dynamic behind that? Why do people feel so uncomfortable with other people having a different experience or interpretation to the point that they feel like they need to prove you wrong on an experience? I've even had this on times where I've shared personal experiences that I've had like in college or in the writing industry, where I said this was my experience with this thing, and commenters go, "Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe you. You didn't have that because that never happens." You,
Exactly. They'll
it's
say
my
that. They're like, well, how do
experience.
you
Like,
know that? Like,
why do you need to prove me wrong that my experiences happen? So let me know what your guys' thoughts are on the social dynamic between just having a different opinion and people that think that there is a correct opinion on obviously opinionated things.
I remember before we get into that one, just a personal anecdote here. I remember a certain person was talking about how she thought something was fat phobic and it bothered her because if you use this language, then that means you're fat phobic. I'm like, I'm fat and that doesn't bother me. So why is my experience invalid but yours isn't? See, that's
Yep.
I don't like, it's retarded.
So then now we're going to get into the modern postmodern, because a lot of the conversations around this and around generative AI even fall into what postmodernism was trying to do to art. And I think a lot of people fell into this trap without realizing it because they don't understand art history or art analysis. But again, I'm not an art historian specifically. I'm a person that does art and has opinions. So if other people want to jump in on this, feel free
Yes.
to. I am an idiot. But the term was first used around 1970 as an art movement. Postmodernism to some extent defies definition, as there is no one postmodern style or theory on which it is hinged. It embraces many different approaches to art making and may be said to begin with pop art in the 1960s and to embrace much of what followed, including conceptual art, neo-expressionism, feminism or feminist art, and the young British artists of the 1990s. Postmodern art or postmodernism was a reaction against modernism. Modernism was generally based on idealisms and a utopian version of human life and society and a belief in progress. It's assumed that certain ultimate universal principles or truths, such those formulated by religion or science, could be used to understand or explain reality. Modernist arts experimented with form, technique, processes, rather than focused on subjects, believing that they could find a way to purely reflect the modern world. So modernism was still about expressing beauty and actually was about expressing utopianism. While modernism was based on idealism and reason, postmodernism was born of skepticism and a suspicion of reason. It challenged the notion that there are universal certainties or truth, which includes the idea of there is certain beauty. They go, oh, you want to say that there is an actual definition of beauty? Screw you. Postmodern art drew on philosophies of the mid to late 20th century and advocated that individual experience and interpretation of our experiences was more concrete than abstract principles. While the modernist championed clarity and simplicity, postmodernism embraced complexity and often contradictory layers of meaning. Anti-authoritarian by nature, postmodernism refused to recognize the authority of any single style or definition of what art should be. So in any cases where you're seeing somebody say, this is art, anything can be art, that's actually a postmodernist take on art. It collapsed the distinction between high culture and mass or pop culture, between art and everyday life, because postmodernism broke the established rules about style. It introduced a new era of freedom and a sense that anything goes. Often funny, tongue-in-cheek, or ludicrous, it can be confrontational or controversial, challenging the boundaries of taste, but most crucially, it reflects a self-awareness of style itself, often mixing different artistic or popular styles of media. Postmodernist art can also consciously and self-consciously borrow from ironically comment on a range of styles of the past. So one of the things that this did, I think there's a thing here, is that it wanted to delegitimize the skills that are behind art. Because if somebody said, look, Dadaism has requirements in order to be considered a Dadaist art. Yes. The same if you were like, oh, this song has to be in this style in order to be considered rock. This has to be in this style to be classical. This has to be in this style to be surrealism. What postmodernism did is said, we don't like that you are defining things, so we are going to say anything can be art. So when people in these conversations about art bring up a toilet, which is specifically going to be mentioned here, and say, well, that was considered art, or a piece of canvas that has a dot in it, it says, well, look, they say that is art. You're falling into the trap of postmodernism, which was meant to devalue all art.
It's a protest. It's
not
a
protest against the technique, the skill, the time, the creativity that is used in every single other kind of art.
Yeah. And that's what gets it. It's like, well, if art is subjective, then that means anything's art. Like, no, there's a criteria that needs to be met. It's the same thing with genre fiction. When you write a book, you can't just label something fantasy when it doesn't fit the criteria for any. I don't care what kind of fantasy it is, but if it doesn't fit the criteria for fantasy, it's not a fantasy. All right. If it's not if it's not rock and roll, it doesn't fit the criteria for rock and roll, it's not rock and roll. Okay.
Yep.
And the same thing applies for art. It's not a toilet is not art. It's a utility, obviously. And again, the only objective thing about art is that it is art. The same thing. The only objective thing about a movie is that it is a movie. But it's the same thing. It's like when you're looking at a painting, that's art. You might not even like it. That doesn't mean that it's any less a painting. But a dot on a canvas, that is not meant to be art. That's meant to be a protest. And that is the postmodernist idea. So like we were talking very earlier on about how they'll always say modern art sucks. And I'm just like, you do realize that like Van Gogh, Michelangelo, and like Rembrandt all fall under the category umbrella term of modern art, right? Even if they've been dead for hundreds of years. They still fall under the category because they fit the criteria for certain umbrella artistic styles,
If you look here, in essence, the grand rejection of boundaries between high and low art, which is the entire spectrum of art, a lack of artistic direction, and a disruption of genres with style, such as collage or fragmentation, is what ultimately defined postmodern art. So the disruption in general of art is what postmodern art is.
Yes. Essentially, this is what these people want. It is a postmodernist idea because they want to determine what they think art is, and they don't want the artists saying what art is, defining it, giving it structure, right? To identify it. They want to undermine that because of whatever reasons. Because I guess it stems from this thing, I think, at least, this is just my theory. I think people have a hard time accepting that they might not be an artist or they might not be a writer, right? They might not be any of these things. But for some reason, they can accept that they just don't have the aptitude to be a lawyer or a doctor or a rocket scientist or a technician at a hospital or a nurse. Like, people can accept that they don't have these qualities in them to really determine what they're going to be in life, or a veterinarian. I wanted to be a veterinarian when I was a kid. I'm not a veterinarian now, I'm an artist, because it spoke to me in a way that is very specific to who I am as a person, and the same applies for you, and whenever, for some reason, I think it's because they think it's easy to do. But when you look at any kind of art piece, right, there is a level of skill that goes into it that just cannot be replicated by anybody. Not anybody can just do it. And people have a hard time accepting that. And so I think that's why part of the reason they're throwing a fit and demanding that either we do what they want or they're going to do what the hell they want, and they're going to define art in their own way. And they're going to bulldoze the rest of us over. And
which means that they're all postmodernists.
They're all postmodernists. That's what they believe in.
So this article will be linked in the description below if you want to read through the whole thing with the history of postmodernism. But the last thing I wanted to bring attention to in this article was originality and authenticity, and how that changed with art and what was defined as art. Is within traditional art that had previously dominated the artistic sphere, and the individuality and the originality of an artwork were key elements that gave it value, both financially and symbolically. This was a concept that was preserved throughout the modernist era, which modernist era includes surrealism, expressionism, Dadaism, Cubism. Like, a lot of different art styles fall under modernism that I don't think people think count as modernist. As the uniqueness of an artwork was what deemed it importance enough to be considered art worth viewing. However, this concept was overthrown in 1917 when Marcel Duchamp exhibited a signed urinal and labeled it art. Duchamp's artwork ridiculed the entire groundwork of which the establishment of art had been constructed, which gave way for artists to begin experimenting with the concept of what informed art. In 1936, Walter Benjamin wrote his influential essay titled The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which he stated that mass reproduction of art could ensure its wider accessibility to society. Doesn't that sound like the conversation people say about generative AI?
Yeah, it does. Oh my goodness, it does. I have that feeling on the back of my neck again, Jim.
Additionally, through using methods such as printing, the artwork created had a lower commodity value. Benjamin's thoughts were later adopted by artists within the pop, minimalist, performance, and conceptual spheres, which led to artists experimenting with a variety of techniques that worked to diminish the idea of authenticity and value in the works created. This was seen in the artwork belonging to Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol, who challenged the concepts of originality and authenticity in their appropriated works through mass production or mass producing items that were printed with well-known imagery, which again is exactly the same argument that the generative AI thieves are doing. They're like, well, you can't copyright an image, or you can't copyright a style, or you can't copyright what is actually yours. I can do it whatever I want, and I can make minute changes to it, and then it's mine.
Yeah. In reality, that's not a sense of, because like everyone knows that ideas derive from the form of other ideas. That's how we learn and create our own things, based on inspiration and communication from another artist, right? You know, that's why I say it's a language. And whenever these people take things and can't, because I was saying this before too, is that it is so, and you've said this also, about how it's much easier to critique something than it is to actually create something. And I do think that that is true, because it really is so much easier to take something apart, put it back together again in its own Frankenstein way that is somehow what you want it to be. But to create it from scratch, and if you're not a creative person, you're not going to get very far, because you're not going to understand the language of art in order to create. And you have to understand that language in order to create and understand it. You can have different varying ways of interpreting a creative person, or what a creative person has done, any artist, but at the end of the day, it is all determined on you and what you get from something. That's why there is a difference in plagiarism and people who are just inspired by something, you know. Mm-hmm. A lot of people want to say Cassandra Clare plagiarized J.K. Rowling. She didn't. Mortal Instruments is very different. I don't like them. It's not my cup of tea, but she did not plagiarize J.K. Rowling's work. She did not. And I think it's like, you can sit here and maybe say it's tacky, but it's not plagiarism.
Yep.
But what AI artists do, just because they can Frankenstein it together into what they want it to look like, which is really not a complicated process at all, no matter how many times they want to tell you that it is, you know, there's no effort, not actually fit the criteria of self-expression, because you're not expressing it. You're just picking what you think looks cool, but you don't know what went into these images. Nothing from your own personal identity went into this. You just typed up a bunch of words, and then the computer spit it out for you. That Frankensteined everybody else's work together to make it. So technically, it's our shit that you're messing. It really is. You know? And that's not self-expression. I can find an image online right now and say, "Oh, this is mine.
This is literally me.
This is literally me," and it's not. You know, maybe small things can convey ideas, but that doesn't mean that it is something that you created.
And so the bottom line with a lot of this is art is an expression of the self. Now, you can also obviously express yourself without creating art. The way that you dress is a form of expression. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you put a mood on like your social media, it's a form of expression. That does not make it art, because there is the technical, the technique, the actual desire to specifically create within something that counts to make it art. And you cannot do it. So I've seen some people arguing also on the topic of AI, to close us out with the AI, saying that, oh, if you use AI, then it can enable more artists, to be better, to make the threshold better. But there is no way to create self-expression by outsourcing the actual means of self-expression. In order to to tell your story, to show the things that you see, you actually have to learn the skill to create the forms of expression.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just a product because you're putting it through
Yeah.
a machine. This goes back to the idea previously mentioned with Oscar Wilde of turning man into this idea of a machine in order to commodify what looks like art.
Yeah, it's the same thing goes when you talked about we talked about how self-expression, right? How like there's utilities, right? But that's not an art, you know, like a color. You can pick the car you want to drive, you can pick the way you want to dress, you can pick the furniture you have in your house. That is self-expression, but it is not art. You didn't make the furniture, you didn't create the clothes, you didn't build the car from scratch, you didn't design the car from scratch. You just picked what you liked because it expressed you in some way, it spoke to you in some way, but that doesn't make it art. It just is kind of determinant of you, because like I like to wear hoodies, you know, all the time. A lot of people don't like that. What your favorite color is a self-expression, like, but that doesn't mean that you're the artist. You know, you didn't make the clothes, you didn't build or design the car.
It's a specific form of technique plus self-expression.
Yes,
those are. You can, as it goes, there are ways to determine if something is art or is not art. And then once you get into those subcategories of art, is music better than film? Are books better than music? Those are all subjective. And so there's no way to actually get to it. In the same way that you can't, is fantasy better than romance? Is literary fiction better than fantasy? Those are all going to be subjective opinions with the criteria in order to fit into those genres. The criteria is objective. The opinion of which is better is subjective.
Exactly.
And then the way that everybody evaluates whether they like something or not doesn't make it invalid because it's subjective. It just tells other people if you evaluate the same way. And so then if you can actually converse on the book in the same way or the movie on the same way, or if you're going to have different conversations because you absorb things differently.
Yeah. And again, that's how discussion happens. It's the only way to really have discussion, you know, is to you know, kind of talk to each other about what you've experienced and see what somebody else experienced and how it, you know, aligns or differs from your own. But again, like I said, you can't objectively have a conversation about anything without, if you want to speak on it objectively, then there's not going to be much of conversation. It's just going to be yes or no.
Yep. And so this eventually for me ends on a note of hope, because there's not one way to absorb art. There's not one way to make art. There are lots of ways to make art. Focus on the aesthetics or the styles that you specifically like. It's the same reason why, like when I do the Fresh Meat feature or I talk about books here, I might not like it, but you might, or I may love it and you may hate it. It's for anybody who creates art, who wants to express themselves. There is an audience out there. And just because one form of art or one creation of art isn't for you, doesn't mean that there are not others out there creating specifically for the thing that you love. And I don't know where this conversation is coming from in the current zeitgeist, where it's everything is against my specific version of art, but that's just not true. So I know so many artists, I know so many writers who are all doing completely different things. So if you think that what you're looking for is not out there, let me assure you that it is. And if you're a creator and you think that there is not a space out there for an audience that is looking for what you're making, let me assure you that there is, because there always is. And it is about your expression if you're creating art as opposed to a product. If you're creating a product, then you know you got to do market research on that. But
you got to look for this stuff. You know, you have to. It took me a long time to find the people that I fit in with the best. And then I eventually found them. And it's a lot of legwork. It's a lot of, you know, sad nights of feeling lonely and by yourself. But if you try and keep trying to find what you want, you will find it. Don't expect somebody to give it to you, you know, but it is out there. I assure you it is out there. I've seen it. Like,
so that'll conclude the conversation about art today. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. Am I a total idiot and just misinterpreted literally everything that I said today? Did you know about what postmodern art actually was and what modern art was? Because this is now something that's been biting at me every time I hear somebody say modern art sucks. I'm like,
oh yeah, me too. Because I'll be sitting here like, what? I know, right? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you looking at? Like, Because they talk about the museums all the time. I'm like, fuck the museums, just look on the internet. For God's sake, it's the biggest museum there is. Like,
Mhm.
it's
So
just absurdity.
now go out, express yourself, enjoy arts of your choosing,
And don't
and
die.
don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out? The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross. Is he in trouble? We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him. Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Way. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?